In a land where fear speaks louder than truth, there lived a man they called a monster. A man whose name could silence a town, whose past was buried under ash and blood. But what if everything they believed was wrong? What if the devil they feared was the only one who could save them? Tonight, you'll hear a story about a broken man, a fearless woman, and a deal that was never meant to become love. Stay with me, because nothing in this story is what it seems. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to support more stories like this.
They called me a lot of things in Delwood, and most of them weren't fit to be repeated in polite company. If you ask the old men chewing tobacco on the porch of the general store, I was a cold-blooded killer who had buried a man out by the ridge back in '69. If you asked the church-going women, I was the devil himself, the arsonist who had torched the neighboring ranch just to watch the sky burn. I was the monster of Red Rock Canyon, a man whose soul was as scarred and barren as the dirt he worked. I never bothered to correct them. The truth of what happened 7 years ago was my own private hell, and if the town's wild imagination kept them off my land, I considered it a fair trade. Fear is a highly effective fence. It doesn't rust, and it doesn't need mending. It was mid-August, the kind of blistering, unforgiving heat that bakes the moisture right out of your lungs. I was out by the main corral, my shirt soaked through with sweat, wrestling a stubborn iron shoe onto the hooves of a restless Mustang. The air tasted of dust and dry sage. It was a quiet life. Brutal, but quiet. Just me, my mute ranch hand Eli, and a silence so heavy it could break a man's back if he wasn't used to carrying it. That was when I heard the steady, rhythmic thud of hooves coming up the canyon road. I dropped the horse's leg, wiping the grease and sweat from my brow with the back of my forearm. I squinted against the glaring sun. Usually anyone who wandered up this far realized they were approaching the Vance property and turned tail before they even reached the creek. But this rider wasn't stopping. As the horse crossed the shallow water and started up the incline toward my gate, I realized two things. First, the rider was a woman. Second, she was riding a chestnut mare that had seen better days. But she sat in the saddle with a spine straight as a Winchester rifle. I stepped out from the shade of the barn, leaning my heavy frame against the corral post. I deliberately let my hand rest near the colt tied to my thigh. Not to draw it, but to remind her exactly whose land she was trespassing on. I pulled my hat down low, fixing my face into the cold, dead-eyed stare that usually sent traveling salesmen and lost travelers scrambling for the county line. She pulled up to the wooden gate, right under the rusted iron sign that read, Red Rock Ranch. She wasn't a fragile, parasol-twirling city girl. She wore a simple, dust-covered blue dress that had seen its fair share of mending, and a wide-brimmed riding hat that cast a shadow over her face. But it didn't hide her eyes. They were a striking stormy gray, and they were locked dead onto mine. There wasn't a flicker of hesitation in them. No trembling hands holding the reins. No nervous swallows. She looked at me, a scarred, filthy 6'3" outcast with a reputation painted in blood. The same way a woman might look at a sack of flour she was thinking about buying. "You're Silas Vance," she said. Her voice was clear, carrying over the dry wind without a tremor. "I am," I replied, my voice rough from disuse. "And you're trespassing on a property that folks in town usually warn you about." "They warned me," she said smoothly, dismounting with practiced ease. She tied her mare to the hitching post like she owned the place, then stepped right up to the fence, putting herself mere inches from me. Up close, I could see the exhaustion bruising the skin under her eyes, but the fire in them was undeniable. She was maybe 28, too old to be a naive runaway, too hardened to be a fool. "If they warned you," I growled, stepping closer, letting my height and my shadow loom over her, "then you know you should get back on that horse and ride south before I lose what little patience I have." She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She just reached into the pocket of her skirt, pulled out a neatly folded piece of heavy parchment, and held it out to me through the wooden rails. "My name is Clara Hayes," she said, ignoring my threat entirely. "My father died 3 weeks ago and left me the Silver Creek property, a mountain of bank debt and a target on my back. I am entirely out of options, Mr. Vance, and from the look of your dying cattle out in the east pasture, you're out of water." I narrowed my eyes, refusing to take the paper. "What is this, Miss Hayes? You looking for a job? Because I don't hire women, and I sure as hell don't take charity." "I'm not looking for a job, and I'm not here to save your soul," Clara said, her chin lifting defiantly as she met my glare. "I have the only deep water well within 50 miles that hasn't dried up. And you have a reputation so terrifying that not a single soul in this county will dare cross your shadow." She pushed the paper closer to my chest. "I didn't come to work for you, Silas Vance. I came here to ask you to marry me." For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sound in the yard was the unrelenting wail of the canyon wind and the nervous snort of her chestnut mare. I stared at the piece of parchment in Clara Hayes's hand, then up to her face, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her composure to crack, for a nervous smile to break through, indicating this was some elaborate, cruel joke concocted by the town drunks. But her gray eyes remained as steady as a predator's. She didn't flinch. She didn't waver. A laugh clawed its way up my throat. It was a harsh, rusted sound, foreign to my own ears. It sounded more like coughing up blood than amusement. "Marry you," I echoed, the words tasting like gravel. I pushed off the corral post towering over her, letting the sheer, intimidating bulk of my frame cast a long shadow over her small figure. "Miss Hayes, I don't know if the sun has boiled your brains on the ride up here, or if you're just plain suicidal, but you have knocked on the wrong gate." "My mind is perfectly sound, Mr. Vance," she replied, her voice dangerously calm. She didn't step back, though my chest was mere inches from hers. I could smell the dust on her clothes, layered over a faint, stubborn scent of lye soap and dried lavender. And I know exactly whose gate I knocked on. I need a monster, and you, from what everyone in Delwood tells me, are the biggest, meanest one in the territory. I crossed my arms, my leather gloves creaking. Let's say, for a second, I entertain this madness. Why in hell would a woman like you want to shackle herself to a man they call the Devil of Red Rock? Clara finally lowered her hand, though she kept the parchment gripped tightly. "Because Thaddeus Thorne is in town." The name hit the air like a lead weight. Thaddeus Thorne, the railroad baron, the man whose very existence was a plague upon the West, a suit-wearing vulture who bought up distressed land for pennies on the dollar, and if the owners didn't want to sell, they usually ended up trampled by their own herds or burned alive in their beds. He was a man I knew, a man I had a history with, a history written in ash and unmarked graves. "Thorne," I muttered, feeling the familiar cold rage coil in my gut. "He's making a play for Silver Creek?" "He's making a play for the whole valley," Clara corrected, her tone hardening. "My father died 3 weeks ago. Heart gave out. Before he was even cold in the ground, Thorne's men were at my door, offering to relieve me of my debt. When I refused, our fences were cut. Last night, our barn mysteriously caught fire. My younger sister Lily and I managed to put it out, but I'm not a fool, Mr. Vance. We are 2 unmarried women on a prime piece of acreage. Thorne won't stop until we're dead or driven out. The law in Delwood is in his pocket. The bank is in his pocket. And you think marrying me is going to stop him?" I scoffed, though the machinery in my head was already turning. "I know it will," she said, taking a deliberate step closer. "Thorne's men are thugs, but they aren't brave. They prey on the weak. They prey on grieving daughters. But they are terrified of you. Everyone is. If I am Clara Vance, if Silver Creek legally becomes part of Red Rock, they won't touch it. They won't dare cross your property line." "That explains what you get out of it," I said, leaning down so my face was level with hers. I let my voice drop to a low, menacing gravel. But what makes you think I give a damn about you, your sister, or your land? I don't play hero, Miss Hayes. Not anymore. Clara didn't blink. She simply lifted the parchment again. Because of the water. My jaw tightened. She had done her homework. It hasn't rained properly in 4 months, Clara stated, her eyes flicking toward the eastern ridge where the carcasses of 3 of my calves were currently feeding the buzzards. Your eastern creek is completely dry. Your main wells are pulling up mud. In 2 weeks, your herd is going to start dying off by the dozens. You have the pasture, Mr. Vance, but you don't have the water. She pointed a gloved finger back the way she came. Silver Creek sits on an underground aquifer. My wells are full. The creek runs deep and cold, straight through the property. Marry me and the water rights are yours. You can drive your herd down to my property tomorrow. You save your cattle. I save my home. It's a transaction, nothing more. I stared at her. She was proposing a business deal, cold and calculated. Wrapped up in the holy sacrament of marriage, it was brilliant, it was desperate, it was entirely insane. You're a practical woman, Miss Hayes, I murmured, studying the determined set of her jaw. But you're missing one crucial detail. Which is? You're assuming the rumors about me are just rumors. I reached out, my heavy, calloused hand gripping the wooden fence rail right beside her head. I leaned in close enough to see the gold flecks in her gray eyes. They say I killed a man with my bare hands. They say I burned my own neighbors out. They say I'm a violent, unpredictable beast who ain't fit for civilized company. What makes you think you'll survive living with me any better than you'd survive Thaddeus Thorne? For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. Not fear, sorrow. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that steely resolve. Because Thorne wants to destroy me for profit, she whispered, her voice steady. But looking at you, Mr. Vance, I don't see a man who destroys things for fun. I see a man who just wants to be left alone. I'll take my chances with the ghost of Red Rock over the vultures in town. Silence descended on the yard again. I looked past her toward the brutal, beautiful expanse of the canyon. If I didn't get water soon, I'd lose everything I had built from the ashes of my past. I'd lose the only sanctuary I had left. The logical part of my brain, the survivor in me, screamed to take the deal. But the darker, broken part of me knew the danger. Bringing a woman, a family, back onto this property. It was inviting the ghost to wake up. If we do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, it's on my terms. You and your sister move here. I won't have my name attached to a woman living miles away, giving Thorne's men a chance to ambush you when I'm not looking. You live at Red Rock. The Silver Creek land becomes a grazing pasture. Clara nodded slowly. Agreed. And know this, I added, my tone turning to ice. This is paper and ink. Nothing more. You keep to your side of the house, I keep to mine. You don't ask about my past. You don't try to save me. And you sure as hell don't expect me to be a husband to you. I expect a barricade, Mr. Vance, not a romance, she replied sharply. She held out the contract. Do we have a deal? I looked at her outstretched hand. I was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, and this small, stubborn woman was offering me a rope. I didn't know if she was going to pull me to safety, or if we were both going to drag each other down into the abyss. I reached out and took the paper. Tomorrow, I grunted. Noon. The mayor's office. Bring your sister, pack your bags, and don't be late. Because if you make me wait, I'm riding back up this canyon without you. I'll be there, Clara said. She turned, untied her horse, and swung up into the saddle with the grace of someone who had practically been born riding. She didn't look back as she spurred the mare into a trot, heading back down the dusty trail toward town. I stood by the gate for a long time watching the dust settle. Then I looked down at the contract in my hand. The ink was elegant, precise. You're a damn fool, Silas, I muttered to myself. I crumpled the parchment into my pocket and turned back toward the barn. Tomorrow, I was getting a wife, and Delwood was about to lose its collective mind. The town of Delwood had never been particularly fond of me, but I reckon the collective gasp that sucked the air out of Mayor Higgins' office that Tuesday noon could have powered a windmill for a week. I had ridden into town wearing my cleanest work shirt, which wasn't saying much, and my worn leather duster. I hadn't bothered to shave the dark scruff masking my scarred jaw. I looked exactly like the thug they all believe me to be. When I pushed open the doors of the town hall, the clerk dropped his ledger, and Mayor Higgins, a rotund man with a perpetual sweat problem, went entirely pale. Clara was already there. She wore a dark, practical traveling suit, her posture rigid. Standing half-hidden behind her was a girl of about 15, clutching a woven carpetbag to her chest like a shield. That had to be Lily. The kid looked at me with wide, terrified doe eyes, clearly convinced her older sister was willingly walking into the jaws of a wolf. "Mr. Vance," Higgins stammered, frantically dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. We weren't expecting you in town." "I'm here for a license, Higgins," I growled, stepping into the room. My boots sounded too loud on the floorboards. "And a ceremony. Now." "A ceremony?" Higgins squeaked, his eyes darting between me and Clara. "Miss Hayes and I are to be married," I said, crossing my arms. I looked at the clerk, whose jaw was practically on the floor. "Close your mouth, son, before you catch a fly. Fetch the paperwork." The next 20 minutes were a blur of bureaucratic terror. Higgins sped through the vows as if reading them too slowly might cause me to shoot him. There was no ring. There was no kiss. When he pronounced us husband and wife, I simply nodded, signed the register with a heavy, scratching scrawl, and turned to my new bride. "Wagons outside," I said curtly. "Load your things." Walking out of that building, the street was entirely silent. The locals had gathered on the boardwalks, staring at us as if we were a funeral procession. I saw old Mrs. Pewitt outside the dry goods store. She actually crossed herself as we walked past. I ignored them all, taking the heavy trunk from Clara's hands and tossing it into the back of my buckboard as easily as if it were a sack of feathers. I helped Lily up into the back. The girl flinched when my hand accidentally brushed her arm. I felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest at the reaction, but I masked it with a scowl, turning away to climb into the driver's seat. Clara sat beside me, her back straight, looking straight ahead. "Hyah!" I snapped the reins, and the horses pulled us out of town, leaving a cloud of dust and a storm of whispers in our wake. The ride to Red Rock was brutal in its silence. The canyon walls rose around us, casting long, jagged shadows across the trail. I kept my eyes on the road, acutely aware of the woman sitting inches from me. For 7 years, the only breathing souls on this wagon had been me and Eli. Having a woman beside me, smelling faintly of lavender, the rustle of her skirts against the wooden bench, felt dangerously invasive. When we finally pulled through the gates of the ranch, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the canyon in bruised shades of purple and red. I pulled the team to a halt in front of the main house. It was a sturdy 2-story timber and stone building I'd built with my own hands, but it wasn't a home. It was a shelter. The porch was bare, the windows were unadorned, and the yard was strictly functional. Eli came out of the barn, wiping a rag on his trousers. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the women. He looked at me, raising a bushy gray eyebrow in a silent, deafening question. I gave him a sharp shake of my head, signaling, "Not now." I jumped down and began unloading their bags. "Eli," I said, signing the words with my free hand as I spoke. "Take the team, water them." Eli nodded slowly, still staring at Clara, before taking the reins. I carried their trunks up the steps and kicked the front door open. "Inside," I ordered. Clara and Lily stepped over the threshold. The inside of the house was meticulously clean. I didn't tolerate filth, but it was entirely devoid of life. There were no rugs, no pictures on the walls, no curtains, just heavy wooden furniture, a massive stone hearth, and the lingering smell of wood smoke and old coffee. "The main bedroom is at the top of the stairs," I told them, dropping the trunks in the center of the room. "The guest room is down the hall to the left. You two figure out who takes what. The kitchen is fully stocked. Pantry's round the back. The well water is safe, but boil it anyway." Clara looked around, her sharp eyes taking in the barrenness of my existence. "And where will you be sleeping?" she asked. "I won't," I said flatly. She frowned. "Excuse me?" "I sleep out back," I lied smoothly. "There's a cabin attached to the tack room. It's where I stay." "That's ridiculous," Clara countered, stepping toward me. "This is a massive house, Mr. Vance. There are at least 3 bedrooms upstairs. You don't need to exile yourself to the barn. What will the ranch hands think?" "I don't have ranch hands. I have Eli, and Eli doesn't care. And it's not an exile, Mrs. Vance. It's a boundary." I stressed the new title, letting it hang in the cold air between us. "Our contract said I provide you protection and a roof. I didn't agree to play house. I like my space. You're going to like yours. Lock the doors at night. If you hear anything prowling around the yard, you stay inside and let me handle it. Understood?" Lily shrank behind her sister, but Clara just set her jaw. "Perfectly. Good." I turned on my heel and walked out, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. I didn't sleep in the tack room that night. I slept on a bedroll in the hayloft, staring up at the cracks in the roof, listening to the wind howl. I had given up my bed, my quiet, and the ironclad isolation I had spent 7 years cultivating, all for a few thousand gallons of water. The next few days were an exercise in quiet torture. I tried to stay away from the main house. I spent my days riding out to Silver Creek with Eli, breaking down Clara's fences to merge the herds, driving my desperate, thirsty cattle down to the deep running water of her property. It was grueling, dirty work, but the water was real. Clara hadn't lied. The aquifer was a gold mine. But every evening when I rode back into the yard of Red Rock, the changes hit me like a physical blow. It started small. On the 3rd day, I walked past the house and smelled roasting meat and garlic, a smell so fiercely domestic it made my stomach twist into a knot. I had survived on salted pork, beans, and hardtack for years. On the 4th day, I saw Lily out in the yard. She was terrified of me, scurrying away like a frightened rabbit whenever I came within 50 yards, but she had found a broom and was sweeping the dust off the porch. On the 5th day, there was a checkerboard tablecloth on the kitchen table. It was maddening. They were domesticating my graveyard. I was standing by the water trough one evening, aggressively scrubbing the dirt and horse sweat off my arms, when the back door of the house creaked open. I froze. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She wasn't wearing her stiff town clothes. She wore a simple, faded cotton dress, her sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that were tanned and toned from hard labor. She carried a basket of wet laundry on her hip. I watched her from the shadows of the barn, completely still, like a hunted animal. She moved with an effortless, practical grace. She strung a line between 2 porch posts and began pinning up wet shirts, my shirts. I had left a pile of dirty clothes in a basket by the wash house, fully intending to do them myself on Sunday. Now there they were, smelling of lye and fresh water, snapping in the evening breeze. The wind caught a stray lock of her dark hair, whipping it across her face. She paused, blowing it out of her eyes with a huff of annoyance, then reached up to pin the last shirt. The fading sunlight caught the curve of her neck, the elegant line of her spine. Something cracked inside my chest, a deep, tectonic shift beneath the ice I had built around my heart. I realized with a sudden suffocating panic that I wasn't just watching a woman do laundry. I was watching my wife. I was watching life happen on Red Rock Ranch. I gripped the edge of the water trough, my knuckles turning white. I wanted to march over there, tear the clothes down, and yell at her to stop acting like she belonged here. But I also wanted, with a desperation that terrified me, to walk up those stairs, wrap my arms around her waist, and bury my face in her neck. Monster, I reminded myself, forcing the dark thoughts back down. You are a monster. Leave her be. I turned away from the light of the house and walked deeper into the shadows of the barn. But as I sat in the hayloft that night, listening to the distant sound of Clara and Lily's muted laughter bleeding through the timber walls of my home, I knew one thing for certain. The contract had bought me water, but it was going to cost me my sanity. I should have known better than to let her out of my sight. It had been 10 days since the wedding. 10 days of a fragile, agonizing truce. I kept to the pastures and the barn. Clara kept to the house. But the supplies she had brought from Silver Creek were running low, and without telling me, she hitched up the wagon and drove the 4 miles into Delwood with Lily. When Eli signed to me that the wagon was gone, a cold dread pooled in my stomach, heavier than lead. I didn't saddle a horse. I threw myself bareback onto my fastest roan and tore out of the canyon like a bat out of hell. The dust hadn't even settled on Delwood's main street when I arrived. I heard the commotion before I saw it. A crowd had gathered outside the mercantile. At the center of the ring stood Clara, her posture rigid, pushing Lily behind her skirts. And standing opposite her, flanked by 4 hired guns wearing expensive dusters and sneers, was Thaddeus Thorne. Thorne hadn't changed in 7 years. He still wore that tailored Eastern suit, still smoked those foul-smelling imported cigars, and still had the eyes of a dead fish. He was holding Clara's arm. Not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to make a point. "It's a simple matter of geography, Mrs. Vance," Thorne was saying, his voice a slick, oiled purr. "Silver Creek belongs to the railroad. Your father knew it. It's a shame you threw away your dignity to marry a savage, thinking it would save a patch of dirt." Clara tried to yank her arm away, but one of Thorne's goons stepped forward, blocking her path. "Take your hands off me," she hissed. "Or what?" Thorne chuckled. "Your ghost of a husband will come haunt me?" I didn't shout. I didn't announce myself. I simply dismounted, the heavy thud of my boots on the boardwalk, parting the crowd like the Red Sea. The townspeople shrank back against the storefronts, their eyes wide with terror. I walked straight up to Thorne's goon, grabbed him by the back of his collar, and threw him so hard into the wooden post of the saloon next door that the timber cracked. The man slumped to the dirt, out cold. Thorne dropped Clara's arm and spun around, stepping back instinctively. His remaining 3 men reached for their holsters. Before their fingers even brushed leather, my Colt was drawn and cocked. The dark, hollow barrel aimed straight at the bridge of Thorne's nose. The metallic click echoed in the dead silence of the street. "Tell your dogs to heel, Thaddeus," I said, my voice a low, gravelly rasp that scraped against the quiet. "Or I'm going to paint this boardwalk with your brains." Thorne swallowed hard, the arrogance melting off his face for a fraction of a second before he forced a tight, ugly smile. He held up a hand, and his men slowly backed away from their guns. "Silas Vance," Thorne drawled, though a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Still playing the brute, I see. Still threatening civilized men like a rabid dog." "You lost the right to be called a civilized man a long time ago," I replied, not lowering the gun an inch. I stepped in front of Clara, shielding her completely. "You're on my time now. This woman is my wife. Silver Creek is my land. You or your men set foot near it. You even look in her direction again, and I won't bother with a warning. I'll just bury you." Thorne's eyes darkened with a venomous hatred. "You think a piece of paper makes you a civilized husband? You think she knows what you really are? I wonder, Clara," Thorne sneered, looking past my shoulder. "Did he tell you how my brother died? Did he tell you what those massive hands of his can do to a man's windpipe?" My finger tightened on the trigger. The urge to end it right then and there, to send him to hell and hang for it, was a roaring fire in my blood. I felt a small, warm hand wrap around my left forearm. Clara. "Silas," she said softly. Not demanding, just grounding me. "Let's go home. He isn't worth the bullet." I kept my gun leveled at Thorne's face for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, slowly, I uncocked the hammer and slid the weapon back into its holster. "Get out of my town, Thorne." I turned, took Clara by the waist, and practically lifted her into the wagon. I grabbed the reins, ignoring the terrified stares of the townsfolk, and drove us out of Delwood. The ride back was suffocating. Lily was shaking like a leaf in the back, and Clara sat rigidly beside me. My knuckles were split and bleeding from where I had punched Thorne's man, the blood drying dark and sticky against my skin. That night, the house was dead silent. I didn't retreat to the barn. I sat on the porch steps, staring out into the pitch-black canyon, a bottle of cheap whiskey dangling between my knees. I was waiting for her to pack her bags. Thorne had planted the seed, and the poison was bound to take root. The screen door creaked open. I didn't look up. I just took another pull from the bottle. Clara walked out holding a lantern in one hand and a basin of water and rags in the other. She set them down on the wooden planks, then sat on the step right beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. Without asking, she took my right hand. She dipped a rag in the warm water and began cleaning the dried blood off my knuckles. Her touch was excruciatingly gentle. "You don't have to do that," I muttered, trying to pull my hand back. "It's just blood." She held tighter. "I know." She wiped away the grime, her head bowed. "Thorne said you killed his brother." I went perfectly still. The wind howled through the canyon, sounding like the screams I tried to drown out every night. I looked down at her dark hair, the delicate curve of her jaw, and knew it was over. "I did," I said, the confession tearing out of my throat like barbed wire. 7 years ago. Thorne and his brother Elias were trying to buy out the valley. Same as now. My wife, Catherine. She was out by the creek. Elias cornered her. I heard her scream. I stopped, my chest tightening so hard I couldn't breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the memory was burned into the backs of my eyelids. By the time I got to her, his hands were on her. He had torn her dress. I didn't use a gun. I pulled him off her, and I wrapped my hands around his neck, and I didn't let go until his face turned purple and his heart stopped beating. I opened my eyes, staring at the dark horizon. Thorne retaliated. A week later, when I was out riding the fence line, his men locked Catherine in the house and set it on fire. She was pregnant. They both burned. The silence that followed was heavier than a gravestone. I waited for her to recoil. I waited for her to look at my hands, the hands of a murderer, and run back inside, lock the door, and pack her things. I was a monster. The town knew it. Thorne knew it. And now she knew it. But Clara didn't let go of my hand. Instead, she lifted my battered, blood-stained knuckles to her lips and pressed a soft, lingering kiss against the bruised skin. The shock of it hit me like a lightning bolt. I jerked my head to look at her. There were tears in her gray eyes reflecting the lantern light. But there was no fear. Not a shred of it. "You didn't kill a man, Silas," she whispered fiercely. "You put down a rabid animal. You are a protector. You protected her, and today you protected me." "Clara," I breathed, my voice breaking. "I don't care what this town thinks," she said, her grip on my hand tightening until it hurt. "I don't care what Thorne says. You are a good man, Silas Vance, and I am not afraid of you." She finished bandaging my hand in silence, picked up the basin, and went back inside. I sat on the porch for hours, staring at the white linen wrapped around my knuckles, feeling the ghost of her lips against my skin, and realizing with terrifying clarity that I was falling hopelessly, dangerously in love with my wife. In the West, trouble doesn't knock. It kicks the door off its hinges. 3 days after the confrontation in town, the oppressive heat that had been suffocating the valley finally broke. But it didn't bring relief. It brought violence. I saw the thunderheads rolling in over the western ridge just past noon, massive, bruised clouds that swallowed the sun and turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The wind shifted abruptly, carrying the metallic scent of ozone and the heavy promise of a deluge. "Eli!" I roared over the sudden shrieking wind. "Get the tack secured. Open the upper pasture gates so the herd can seek high ground." We barely had time to prepare. When the storm hit, it was biblical. The rain didn't fall. It was thrown at the earth in sheets of freezing, blinding water. Lightning split the sky with deafening cracks of thunder that rattled the teeth in my skull. Within minutes, the dry creek beds began to swell with churning, muddy flash floods. I was in the barn trying to calm down a panicked team of draft horses when I heard a terrifying crack over the roar of the storm. I ran to the barn doors and peered out into the deluge. The old timber fence of the north corral had given way under the wind and the mud. Inside that corral were my 4 finest Mustangs, wild, half-broken beasts that I had spent months gentling. Now they were shrieking in terror, rearing up and trying to bolt into the blinding storm where they would easily break their legs in the rocky ravines. I didn't think. I pulled my hat down tight and sprinted out into the mud. The rain hit me like buckshot. I slid into the corral, the mud sucking at my boots up to the ankles. I grabbed a loose halter rope and lunged at the nearest horse, a massive black stallion. The beast reared, its hooves slicing through the air inches from my face. I yelled, pulling down on the rope with all my weight, trying to force it toward the barn. I couldn't hold him. The mud was too slick. I lost my footing, dropping to one knee, the rope burning through my gloves as the stallion prepared to bolt. Suddenly another body slammed into the mud beside me, small, soaked to the bone, and ferociously determined. Clara! She had rushed out of the house in her nightgown and boots, a heavy waxed canvas slicker thrown over her shoulders. She grabbed the trailing end of the rope with both hands, digging the heels of her boots into the muck, and pulled with a strength that defied her size. "Pull him left!" she screamed over the thunder, her hair plastered to her face, water streaming down her cheeks. "Clara, get back in the house!" I roared, terrified a stray hoof would crush her skull. "It's too dangerous." "Shut up and pull!" she yelled back. We hauled backward in unison. The stallion, confused by the double weight and blinded by the rain, finally yielded, dropping its front hooves and letting us drag it toward the open barn doors. We secured it in a stall, then ran back out into the maelstrom for the others. For 30 minutes we fought the storm. We slipped, we fell. We dragged heavy timber across the broken gap in the fence. It was pure, primal survival. At one point, a brilliant flash of lightning struck a dead pine on the ridge, the thunder booming simultaneously. A roan mare panicked, bolting sideways straight toward Clara. I lunged, wrapping my arms around Clara's waist and tackling her out of the way just as 1,000 pounds of panicked horseflesh barreled past us. We crashed into the mud, rolling under the safety of the barn overhang. I hovered over her, my chest heaving, the rain washing the mud from our faces. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. "Are you hurt?" I gasped, running my hands frantically over her arms, her shoulders checking for broken bones. "Clara, are you hurt?" She looked up at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes were wide, dark, and utterly alive. "No," she breathed. "I'm okay. Silas, I'm okay." We were both shivering uncontrollably, soaked to the skin, covered in freezing mud. The horses were safe. The storm was raging outside. "Get up," I ordered gruffly, pulling her to her feet. "You're going to freeze to death. Come on." The main house was too far across the flooded yard. I half-carried, half-dragged her to my cabin attached to the tack room. I kicked the door open and shoved us inside, slamming it shut against the wind. The cabin was small, dark, and smelled of leather and cedar. The silence inside, compared to the roaring storm, was deafening. I fumbled in the dark with freezing fingers, striking a match, and lighting the oil lantern on the table. The warm golden light cast deep shadows across the room. Clara stood near the door, her teeth chattering so hard I could hear it. Her slicker was useless. Her thin nightgown was plastered to her skin, rendered nearly transparent by the rain. I cursed under my breath, stripping off my soaked leather duster and tossing it to the floor. I went to my cot, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and threw it around her shoulders. "Take the wet things off," I said, turning my back to her. My voice sounded harsh, tight. I walked to the small iron stove in the corner and began shoving kindling into it, my hands shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline. "Get dry. I'll get the fire going." I heard the rustle of wet fabric hitting the floor. The sound made my throat go dry. "Silas," her voice was soft. I struck a match, lit the kindling, and forced myself to stare at the small, growing flames. I said, turn your back, Clara. Get under the blanket. Silas, look at me. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the iron edge of the stove. Don't, I warned her, my voice dropping to a dangerous gravel. Don't push this. We have a contract. We have a boundary. If I turn around right now, Clara, that boundary burns to ash. You know what I am. You know I can't be what you need. I know exactly what you are, she said, and her voice was closer now. Right behind me. I felt the heat of her body before I felt her touch. Her hands, still cold but so incredibly soft, slipped around my waist from behind. She pressed her face against my broad, scarred back, right through my damp shirt. You're a man who has punished himself for 7 years for a crime he didn't commit, she whispered against my spine, her breath sending a shudder through my massive frame. You're a man who gave up his bed, who stood between me and a loaded gun, and who just threw himself into the mud to save my life. I don't want a boundary, Silas. I want my husband. A ragged sound tore from my throat. All the resistance, all the ironclad discipline I had forged over the years, shattered into a million pieces. I spun around. She was standing there, wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, her dark hair a wild, beautiful mess around her shoulders, looking up at me with a desire so raw and honest it broke me. I didn't think. I acted on pure, starving instinct. I brought my hands up, framing her face, and crashed my mouth down onto hers. She didn't pull away. She met me with equal ferocity, dropping the blanket to wrap her arms around my neck, pulling me down to her. The kiss tasted of rain, adrenaline, and desperate need. It was clumsy, hard, and perfect. I backed her toward the cot, breaking the kiss only long enough to catch a ragged breath, staring down into her stormy gray eyes. Are you sure? I rasped, my voice trembling. Because if we do this, Clara, there is no going back. You are mine, from now until the day they put me in the dirt. She reached up, her fingers tracing the long, jagged scar along my jaw. A fiery, beautiful smile broke across her face. I've been yours since the moment I walked up to your gate, she said. Outside, the storm battered the walls of red rock, lightning tearing the sky apart. But inside that small cabin, the ghost of Silas Vance finally died, and a man was born again in the arms of the woman who had braved the monster to find him. Waking up had been the hardest part of the last 7 years. Every morning, the brutal transition from the quiet oblivion of sleep to the crushing reality of an empty bed and a silent canyon was a fresh, sharp agony. I had grown accustomed to greeting the dawn with a clenched jaw and a hollow chest, but the morning after the storm was different. I woke before the sun, as I always did, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Clara was curled against my side, her head resting on my shoulder, her dark hair a tangled, beautiful mess spread across my chest. One of her arms was draped across my stomach, holding on to me as if she was afraid the storm might return and pull me away. Her breathing was deep and even, a soft, rhythmic cadence that anchored me to the present. The small cabin was freezing, the fire in the iron stove having died down to glowing embers hours ago. But beneath the heavy wool blankets we were wrapped in a profound, suffocating heat. I lay perfectly still, staring at the rough-hewn timber of the ceiling, afraid that if I shifted my weight I would wake up and find this was all a fever dream. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head to look at her. The bruised exhaustion that had shadowed her eyes since the day she rode up to my gate was gone, replaced by a soft, unguarded peace. I reached up, my large, calloused hand brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. My fingers trembled slightly. I had killed men with these hands. I had broken horses and built houses out of pure, unyielding stone. But touching her required a gentleness I wasn't sure I still possessed. She stirred at my touch. Her thick eyelashes fluttered, and she let out a quiet sigh, leaning into the warmth of my palm. Those stormy gray eyes opened, blinking against the dim gray light filtering through the cabin window. For a second, she looked confused. Then the memory of the night before washed over her face. and a slow, beautiful smile curved her lips. "Morning," she murmured, her voice husky with sleep. "Morning," I rasped back. I felt a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. The walls were down. The ghost was dead. There was nowhere left to hide. "You're freezing." "I'm not," she whispered, sliding her leg over mine and pressing her bare skin flush against my side. "I've never been warmer." We stayed there until the sun crested the canyon rim, bathing the cabin in pale golden light. When we finally gathered our discarded damp clothes from the floor and dressed, the silence between us wasn't a barricade anymore. It was a shared language. We walked across the muddy yard back to the main house. The air was incredibly crisp, smelling of wet sage and ozone. The storm had left Red Rock battered but standing. As we stepped onto the porch, the front door swung open. Lily stood there, a cast iron skillet in one hand, looking between us with wide, anxious eyes. "You're both alive," the girl blurted out, her shoulders dropping in relief. "I thought the wind blew you away. Eli wouldn't let me go out looking for you." I glanced past her into the kitchen. Eli was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand. He looked at me, then at Clara, who was wearing my oversized flannel shirt over her ruined dress, her hair wild, her cheeks flushed. The old mute raised an eyebrow, a slow, knowing smirk spreading across his weathered face. He lifted his coffee mug in a silent toast. I shot him a glare, but I couldn't entirely hide the phantom smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "We're fine, Lily. Just got stranded in the tack room." Breakfast was a quiet, domestic affair that made my chest ache with a strange, soaring hope. For the first time, I sat at the head of the table not as a warden, but as a man in his own home. That peace lasted exactly until 10 o'clock. I was on the porch, pulling on my boots, when the distant sound of splashing hooves echoed up the canyon trail. I stood up, my hand instinctively dropping to the colt at my thigh. 2 riders were making their way through the mud toward the gate. As they got closer, my jaw tightened into granite. It was Sheriff Miller, a man whose badge was practically bought and paid for by the railroad, and a sharp-featured man in an Eastern bowler hat carrying a leather satchel. Clara stepped out onto the porch behind me, drying her hands on an apron. She froze when she saw the riders. "What is the sheriff doing here?" she asked, a thread of panic weaving into her voice. "Nothing good," I muttered, stepping down to intercept them at the hitching post. Miller pulled his horse to a halt. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around the yard as if expecting my non-existent gang of cutthroats to ambush him. He cleared his throat. "Morning, Vance. Mrs. Vance." "State your business, Miller," I growled, crossing my arms over my chest. "And make it quick. The mud is ruining your boots, and your presence is ruining my morning." Miller swallowed hard, glancing at the man beside him. The stranger dismounted, adjusting his spectacles. He didn't look at me. He looked directly at Clara. "Mrs. Vance, my name is Arthur Pendleton. I represent the First National Bank of Chicago," the man said smoothly, opening his satchel and withdrawing a thick sheaf of legal papers. "I'm here regarding the outstanding debts of the late Elias Hayes." Clara stepped down off the porch, her face draining of color. "My father's debts were held by the county bank in Delwood. I spoke to the manager 3 weeks ago. We had an arrangement." "You had an arrangement," Pendleton corrected, stepping forward and extending a document. "2 weeks ago, the county bank's charter was acquired by a private investor. All outstanding debts were called in. The notes on the Silver Creek property were purchased in full." I stepped between Pendleton and my wife, snatching the papers from his hand before he could thrust them at her. I scanned the dense legal jargon. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "Purchased by Thaddeus Thorne," I read aloud, my voice a lethal, vibrating baritone. "Correct," Pendleton said, taking a step back from me. "Mr. Thorne now holds the mortgage on Silver Creek, and, as per the territorial laws of coverture, a husband assumes all financial liabilities of his wife upon marriage." The trap snapped shut. I heard the metallic clack of the jaws closing around my throat. Your marriage didn't protect Silver Creek, Mr. Vance, Miller said, finding a scrap of false courage. It just tied you to the anchor. The debt is $22,000, payable immediately. Since you are legally joined, if the debt is not settled by noon on Friday, the bank has the right to seize all collateral. The collateral for a $22,000 loan, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, is more than Silver Creek. Yes, Pendleton confirmed nervously. The collateral extends to all combined marital assets, including Red Rock Ranch, its livestock, and its water rights. You have 4 days, Mr. Vance, or the sheriff here will return with a federal eviction order. They didn't wait for a reply. Miller spurred his horse, and the two men rode back down the canyon as fast as the mud would allow. I stood in the yard, staring blindly at the paper in my hand. $22,000. It was an astronomical sum. A king's ransom. Thorne hadn't just bought Clara's debt. He had weaponized it. He knew exactly what she was going to do. He let her run to the terrifying outcast. Let her tie her life to mine, knowing that by doing so, she would hand him the keys to the one piece of land he couldn't take by force. Red Rock. I heard a choked gasp behind me. I turned. Clara was shaking, her hands pressed over her mouth. The color had completely vanished from her skin, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll about to shatter. "Silas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh God, Silas, what have I done?" "Clara," I started, stepping toward her, reaching out. She flinched away, taking a frantic step backward up the stairs. "No, no, this was supposed to save you. It was supposed to save the water. I brought him right to your door. I tied a noose around your neck." "Stop," I commanded gently, trying to catch her arm. But she was spiraling into a blind panic. "He's going to take it all. Red Rock, the horses, everything you built from the ashes. I just handed it to him on a silver platter. I ruined you." She spun around and bolted into the house. I cursed, dropping the papers in the mud, and went after her. I found her in the guest bedroom down the hall. She had dragged her trunk out from under the bed and was frantically throwing her dresses into it, her breath hitching with dry, jagged sobs. "Clara, stop packing," I said, stepping into the room. "If I leave," she rambled, tearing a drawer open and grabbing handfuls of stockings. "If I go to Mayor Higgins and declare the marriage unconsummated, we can lie. We can say it was a fraud. You can annul it. If you annul it before Friday, the debt reverts to me. He can take Silver Creek, but he can't touch Red Rock. You'll be safe." She was willing to lose everything. She was willing to throw herself to the wolves, to let Thorne destroy her family's legacy, just to protect a man she had been terrified of 2 weeks ago. I crossed the room in 3 long strides. I caught her wrists, stopping her frantic movements. She struggled against my grip, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Let me go, Silas. I have to fix this. I have to save you." "Look at me," I ordered, my voice a low, immovable anchor in the storm of her panic. I dropped her wrists and framed her face with my large hands, forcing her to meet my eyes. "Look at me, Clara." She stopped fighting, a sob tearing from her throat as she looked up into my face. "You did not ruin me," I said, pronouncing every word with absolute ironclad certainty. "Before you walked up to my gate, I was a ghost haunting my own grave. I was dead, Clara. You woke me up. You brought light back into this house. You brought me back to life." "But Thorne," she choked out. "Thorne thinks he's playing a game with a desperate girl and a dumb, grieving brute," I interrupted, my thumbs wiping the tears from her cheeks. A cold, lethal clarity settled over me. The grief and the fear were gone, burned away by a righteous, purifying fury. "He thinks he cornered an animal, but he forgot one thing." Clara sniffled, her hands coming up to grip my forearms. "What?" I leaned down, pressing my forehead against hers. "He forgot that the rumors about me aren't entirely false. I am a dangerous man to cross, Clara, and I protect what is mine. You are my wife. This is our land. We do not run. We do not hide. And we sure as hell don't surrender to Thaddeus Thorne." She let out a shuddering breath, her eyes searching mine. "We don't have $22,000, Silas. He has the law on his side." I stepped back, dropping my hands, my face hardening into a mask of pure, calculated resolve. "He has corrupt local judges on his side," I corrected her. "But Thaddeus Thorne has a lot more to lose than money. Wipe your face, Mrs. Vance. It's time I showed you what I've really been doing for the last 7 years." The hallway of the upper floor was bathed in the pale, slanting light of the mid-morning sun. Dust motes danced in the air, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than usual. I walked to the end of the hall, my heavy boots making no sound on the runner rug. Clara followed a few paces behind me, her steps hesitant. When I stopped in front of the last door, the heavy oak door at the end of the corridor, she stopped too. Everyone in Delwood had a theory about this room. Some said it was Catherine's nursery, preserved in time like a macabre museum. Others whispered I kept the bones of my victims in here. I had never bothered to correct them, and I had strictly ordered Eli to never let anyone near the upper floor. Clara looked at the brass lock, then up at me. Her eyes were still red-rimmed, but the panic had settled into a quiet, fearful apprehension. "Silas," she said softly, wrapping her arms around her waist, "you don't have to do this. I know what this room is. I know it's where you keep her things, the baby's things. You don't have to open it for me." I reached into the pocket of my vest and pulled out a heavy iron key. "You're a smart woman, Clara," I said, my voice low in the quiet hallway. "But you're wrong about this room." I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clack. I pushed the door open and stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Clara stepped forward, bracing herself for the sight of a dusty crib or folded blankets. But as she crossed the threshold, she stopped dead in her tracks, letting out a sharp gasp of shock. There was no crib, there were no dresses. There was no shrine to a dead family. The room was a war council. The walls were entirely covered. Dozens of county maps, property lines, and railroad schematics were pinned to the wood, crisscrossed with complex webs of red and black string. Names, dates, and bank figures were scrawled on pieces of parchment, tacked violently into the walls. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, groaning under the weight of stacked ledgers, telegraph transcripts, and leather-bound legal folios. And in the very center of the wall above the desk was a charcoal sketch of Thaddeus Thorne, surrounded by a spiderweb of red string connecting him to fires, murders, and bankruptcies across 3 territories. Clara stood frozen, her eyes darting from the maps to the ledgers, taking in the sheer, obsessive magnitude of the room. What is this?" she breathed, walking slowly toward the desk. I stepped into the room, closing the door behind us. The air smelled of old paper, ink, and cold coffee. "When the fire happened 7 years ago," I began, my voice steady, stripped of the raw emotion from earlier, "everyone thought I lost my mind. I let them think it. It was safer for me to be a grieving, violent lunatic. Because a lunatic doesn't ask questions. A lunatic doesn't investigate." I walked over to the wall, tracing a line of red string that connected Thorne's name to a burned-out ranch in the next county. Thorne's brother died by my hand. That's true. But Thorne didn't burn Catherine just for revenge. That was an excuse. He wanted the Red Rock water source even back then. When I survived the fire, he realized he couldn't force me off the land through fear. So he pivoted. He started buying up everything around me, suffocating me, waiting for me to starve or put a bullet in my own head. Clara ran her fingers lightly over a stack of ledgers. "You haven't been hiding, Silas. You've been hunting him." "You can't shoot a man like Thorne in the street, Clara. If I killed him, his corporation would just send another suit to take his place, and I'd hang from a gallows. To kill a beast like that, you don't cut off its head. You drain its blood." I picked up a heavy black leather folio from the desk and handed it to her. Over the last 7 years, I hired Pinkerton detectives through dummy names in Denver. I tracked every shell company Thorne uses to launder money. I tracked the thugs he hires to burn barns and cut fences. I tracked them all the way down to Mexico and up to Montana. I looked into her eyes, my jaw set. 2 years ago, I cornered the man who actually threw the lantern into my house. He's serving a life sentence in a federal penitentiary in Ohio right now under a fake name. But before he went in, he signed a sworn affidavit detailing exactly who paid him to start the fire. Clara opened the folio. Her eyes widened as she scanned the pages. Bank transfers, notarized witness testimonies, evidence of extortion, bribery of federal officials, and contract killings. "Silas," she whispered, looking up at me in absolute awe. "This is a federal conspiracy case. You have enough here to send Thorne to federal prison for the rest of his life. To hang him." "I know," I said grimly. "I was waiting. There's a federal circuit judge, Judge Harrison, arriving in the capital next month. He's known as a hanging judge, and more importantly, he hates railroad monopolies. I was going to ride to the Capitol and hand him this entire room. Thorne would have been arrested by U.S. Marshals before he even knew what hit him." I leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing my arms. "But Thorne forced my hand. He bought your debt, and now the timeline has accelerated. If we wait for the federal judge next month, we lose Silver Creek and Red Rock on Friday to the corrupt local sheriff." Clara didn't panic. The intelligent, practical woman who had proposed to a monster at a wooden gate was back. She dropped the folio onto the desk, pulled out the chair, and sat down. She pulled a brass lamp closer and began opening the ledgers. "He's using the local bank to enforce the debt," Clara murmured, her eyes flying across the columns of numbers faster than I could process them. She was a rancher's daughter who had balanced books her whole life. But the local bank was bought out by an Eastern investor. "A shell company," I confirmed. "Western Expansion Holdings. It's Thorne. If it's Thorne, and he's using funds acquired across state lines to violently coerce property seizures." Clara's finger traced a line down the ledger. She looked up, a fierce, brilliant fire in her gray eyes. "Silas? The telegraph office in town. Does the operator work for Thorne?" "No," I shook my head. "Old man Jenkins hates Thorne. He lost his pension to one of Thorne's railroad schemes a decade ago. He'd cut his own arm off before he helped him." "Good." Clara grabbed a piece of blank parchment and a fountain pen. She started writing furiously. "We don't need to wait for the federal judge to arrive in the Capitol. We just need to stop Sheriff Miller from foreclosing on Friday. If we can wire the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver with specific docket numbers of Thorne's shell companies, proving that the $22,000 debt is fraudulent and part of an ongoing interstate racketeering investigation, the Marshals can issue an emergency federal injunction." She looked up at me, a dangerous, beautiful smirk playing on her lips. "A federal injunction trumps a county sheriff. Miller won't be able to touch us. It will freeze the debt, freeze Thorne's assets, and trigger the federal investigation immediately." I stared at her. I had spent 7 years meticulously gathering the bullets, but Clara had just shown me exactly how to fire the gun. She was brilliant. She was absolutely lethal. "There's only one problem," I said, a slow smile finally breaking through the grim set of my mouth. "Thorne knows I'm a threat. He doesn't know what I have in this room, but he knows I won't go down quietly. He'll have his men watching the road to town. He'll have men watching the telegraph office. If he sees either of us riding into Delwood today, he'll know we're making a play. He'll intercept us." Clara stopped writing. She tapped the pen against her chin, thinking. "Then we don't ride into town today," she said smoothly. "We let Thorne think we're defeated. We let him think we're spending the next 3 days packing our bags and mourning our losses." "And the telegram?" I asked. Clara stood up, holding the drafted message. "We send someone Thorne isn't looking for. Someone who is invisible to him." My eyes widened slightly. I knew exactly who she meant. "Lily," I said. "She's a 15-year-old girl," Clara nodded. Thorne's men are looking for a massive, scarred gunslinger or a desperate wife. They aren't going to look twice at a teenager riding into town to buy flour and sugar. We hide the telegram in her shopping basket. She gives it to Jenkins, Jenkins wires Denver, and we have our injunction by Thursday morning. It was risky. It was terrifying to put the girl in the crosshairs, even invisibly. But it was the only play we had. I looked around the room, the tomb I had built for my grief, the monument to my vengeance. For 7 years, I had stood in this room alone, drowning in the past. Now the woman I loved was standing in the center of it, turning my grief into a sword. I walked over to Clara, pulling her out of the chair and into my chest. I buried my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her. She wrapped her arms around my waist, holding me tight. "Friday is going to be a very bad day for Thaddeus Thorne," I whispered against her temple. Clara pulled back, looking up at me with eyes like polished steel. "No, Silas," she said, her voice ringing with the uncompromising grit of the true West. "Friday is the day the Devil of Red Rock finally comes to collect." Wednesday morning broke with a deceptive stillness. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the air was sharp and cold, entirely betraying the storm of violence brewing just over the horizon. We gathered in the kitchen before dawn. Lily stood by the door wearing a simple wool coat and a bonnet that hid her face well enough. She clutched a woven wicker basket tightly to her chest. Beneath a folded layer of flour sacks and a list of dry goods lay the telegram that Clara had drafted, the federal injunction that would freeze Thaddeus Thorne's empire. "You ride straight to the telegraph office," I instructed, my voice low and serious. I knelt slightly so I was eye level with the 15-year-old girl. She was trembling, but she held my gaze. "Do not stop at the mercantile. Do not speak to anyone on the street. You walk in, you hand this directly to Jenkins, and you wait until you hear the machine clicking. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Vance," Lily whispered. "Once it's sent," Clara added, adjusting her sister's collar with shaking hands, "you ride straight back. Don't push the horse too hard on the rocky trails, but don't linger. We will be waiting for you." I walked Lily out to the yard. I had saddled my fastest mare, a nimble roan that could outrun anything Thorne's thugs rode. I lifted the girl into the saddle. For a moment, I let my hand rest on the horse's flank, looking up at her. "You're a brave girl, Lily," I said quietly. It was the first time I had offered her a genuine compliment, stripped of my usual gruffness. A small, proud smile broke through her fear. She nodded, snapped the reins, and rode out through the gates, disappearing down the canyon trail. The waiting was a special kind of hell. Clara and I spent the morning going through the motions of chores, trying to maintain the illusion of a defeated, broken household. I chopped wood with a ferocity that left my shoulders burning. Clara scrubbed the kitchen floor until her knuckles were raw. We didn't speak much. The tension was too thick, a living, breathing thing in the room with us. Every rustle of the wind, every snap of a dry twig, made my hand jump to the heavy iron of my Colt. By late afternoon, the sun began to dip behind the canyon ridges, casting long, bloody shadows across the yard. Lily should have been back an hour ago. I was standing by the corral, scanning the eastern trail through a spyglass, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ached. Clara stood beside me on the porch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Silas," she said, her voice strained. "She should be back." "I know," I muttered. "I'm going to saddle up. I'll ride out to meet her." I turned toward the barn, but I never took the first step. From the upper ridge of the canyon, a piercing, frantic whistle cut through the air. It was Eli. He was waving his arms wildly, pointing down the trail. A horse was galloping toward the gate. It was the roan mare, but the saddle was empty. My heart stopped. It didn't just skip a beat. It ceased to function in my chest. Clara let out a strangled scream, rushing down the steps. I caught the mare by the bridle as she frantically trotted into the yard, her sides heaving, lathered in sweat. Tied to the saddle horn was a piece of red cloth, Lily's bonnet ribbon. "No!" Clara gasped, covering her mouth. "No, no, no!" "Get in the house, Clara. Grab the rifle," I roared, my instincts instantly overriding my panic. If the horse was here with a message, Thorne's men weren't far behind. They had intercepted her. But Thorne was a predator who didn't play by the rules of men. He didn't wait for me to come to him. He brought the war to my doorstep. Before Clara could reach the porch, the sharp, deafening crack of a Winchester rifle echoed from the eastern ridge. The wooden post next to Clara's head splintered into a shower of sharp shrapnel. She shrieked, dropping to the dirt. "Clara!" I drew my Colt and fired 2 blind shots toward the ridge to force the sniper down, sprinting across the open yard. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions. The canyon walls amplified the sound until it felt like we were standing in the middle of a battlefield. Dirt kicked up around my boots. I dove, sliding into the dust, and grabbed Clara by the waist, dragging her behind the heavy stone water trough. "Stay down!" I bellowed over the roar of another rifle shot that pinged off the stone inches from my head. "They have Lily!" Clara cried, tears streaming down her face, her fingers digging into my shirt. "Silas, they have her!" "I'll get her back," I swore, my eyes scanning the perimeter. There were at least 6 of them. 2 on the ridge, 4 advancing through the scrub brush near the main barn. They were moving tactically, keeping us pinned. "Vance!" a voice boomed from the tree line. It was Thorne's lead enforcer, a scarred brute named Carver. "The boss sends his regards. We intercepted the little bird before she could sing to the telegraph operator. She's keeping Mr. Thorne company in town, but he figured you needed a reminder of what happens when you don't pay your debts." My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. They hadn't come to kill me. They had come to break me. "Burn it!" Carver yelled. 2 men broke from the tree line, sprinting not toward the house, but toward the massive timber barn where the winter hay and supplies were stored. One of them hurled a lit glass bottle filled with kerosene. It crashed against the dry timber walls. Whoosh! A wall of orange flame erupted instantly, greedily crawling up the side of the barn. Thick black smoke began to billow into the twilight sky. And then the nightmare became real. "Silas!" Clara screamed, pointing past me. While I had been focused on the barn, 2 more thugs had flanked us from the rear of the house. I spun around, raising my Colt, but one of them tackled Clara, dragging her away from the trough. I fired, dropping the man beside him with a bullet to the chest, but the other goon hauled Clara to her feet, holding a knife to her throat. "Drop it, Vance, or I slit her pipe right here," the man snarled. I froze, the gun heavy in my hand. I looked at Clara. Her eyes were wide, but she gave me a sharp, imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't surrender." Before I could make a move, a loud whistle pierced the air. Carver and his remaining men fell back. The man holding Clara suddenly shoved her violently backward, straight through the open side door of the burning barn. She stumbled, crashing into the hay bales inside. The thug slammed the heavy sliding doors shut and dropped a massive iron bar across the outside latch, locking it. "Let's ride!" Carver shouted, mounting his horse. The men fired a final volley at the trough to keep me down, then spurred their horses, tearing out of the yard. I didn't care about the fleeing men. I didn't care about the gunfire. I could only see the flames. The fire was roaring now, consuming the dry timber, the heat radiating across the yard in suffocating waves. Inside that inferno was my wife. Not again. The thought echoed in my skull, a violent, deafening scream. The memories of 7 years ago, the screams, the heat, the smell of burning flesh, the paralyzing helplessness crashed over me like a tidal wave. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of Silas Vance stood there, frozen in terror. Then, a new voice cut through the trauma. Clara's voice in my head. "You are a protector." The fear evaporated, incinerated by a rage so pure and absolute it felt divine. I was not a victim anymore. I was the devil of Red Rock, and they had just locked my wife in hell. I didn't hesitate. I holstered my gun, lowered my shoulder, and charged straight into the fire. The heat was a physical wall pressing against my skin, singeing the hair on my arms and turning the air into breathing glass. The crackle of the flames was deafening, drowning out the world. I hit the heavy sliding barn door with the force of a battering ram. My shoulder slammed into the thick oak. The iron bar holding it shut groaned, but it didn't give. I backed up, coughing as the thick black smoke seared my lungs, and kicked the timber with my heavy riding boots. Once, twice. "Clara!" I roared, my voice tearing my throat. "Silas!" Her voice came from inside, faint but desperate. "The roof is catching!" I drew my Colt. I pressed the muzzle directly against the iron brackets holding the heavy padlock bar, and fired twice. The metal shattered. I threw my weight against the door, and it slid open with a screech of warping iron. I plunged into the inferno. The inside of the barn was a vision of hell. The upper loft was entirely engulfed, raining burning hay and embers down onto the dirt floor. The smoke was blinding. I ripped the bandana from my neck, pressed it over my mouth, and squinted through the orange haze. "Clara! Here!" I found her near the back stalls. She was coughing violently, her dress scorched, but she was alive. She had dragged a heavy horse blanket over herself to ward off the falling embers. I dropped to my knees beside her, hauling her up into my arms. "I've got you. I've got you," I choked out, pressing her face into my chest to shield her lungs from the smoke. As we turned to the exit, a massive structural beam from the loft cracked with the sound of a cannon shot. It plummeted down, crashing directly in front of the doorway, blocking our path with a wall of burning timber. We were trapped. "The back window!" Clara yelled over the roar of the fire, pointing toward the tack room. I carried her through the smoke, kicking open the door to the tack room. It was slightly cooler here, but the flames were already eating through the walls. The window was high up, barred with a thin wooden grate. I grabbed a heavy iron anvil from the workbench and hurled it through the glass and wood, shattering the barrier. "Go! Climb!" I ordered, lifting her by her waist. Clara scrambled through the jagged opening, falling into the muddy grass outside. I pulled myself up, squeezing my massive frame through the tight window just as the roof of the tack room collapsed behind me in an explosion of sparks and ash. I hit the ground rolling, gasping for clean air. My lungs burned, my clothes were smoking, and my hands were blistered, but I didn't care. I grabbed Clara, pulling her into an embrace so tight I thought I might break her ribs. We lay in the dirt, chests heaving, watching the barn burn to the ground. "You came for me?" she sobbed into my shoulder, her hands gripping my soot-stained shirt. "You didn't freeze. You came." "I will always come for you," I swore, pressing my face into her hair. But our relief was short-lived. Over the crackle of the dying fire, I heard the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on gravel. I pushed Clara behind me and staggered to my feet, my hand going to my holster. Through the haze of the smoke walked Thaddeus Thorne. He wasn't in town. Carver had lied. Thorne was here, flanked by two more men holding a silver-plated revolver. And worst of all, one of his men had a terrified, sobbing Lily by the hair, a knife to her throat. "Touching," Thorne sneered, stopping 20 paces away. He looked at the burning barn, then at me. His pristine suit was out of place in the blood and ash of my yard. "I must admit, Vance, you're harder to kill than a cockroach. I thought for sure you'd burn with her this time." "Let the girl go, Thorne," I rasped, drawing my Colt and aiming it directly at his chest. "This is between you and me." "This is between me and my property," Thorne corrected coldly. "You have something of mine in that house. Ledgers. Maps. Don't look surprised. Carver found a little draft of a telegram on the girl. You thought you could wire the feds behind my back? You thought you could build a case against me?" Thorne raised his silver revolver, aiming it at my head. "You're going to walk into that house, Vance, and you're going to bring me every scrap of paper in that locked room. Then I'm going to shoot you. If you don't, my man slits the girl's throat, and then I shoot your wife." I calculated the odds. 3 men. My gun held 4 bullets. I was fast, but I wasn't fast enough to drop the man holding Lily before he twitched his knife. "All right," I said, my voice eerily calm. I slowly began to lower my gun. "Let her go. I'll get you the papers." "Silas, no!" Clara screamed from behind me. Smart man, Thorne smiled triumphantly. He made the mistake of looking at the burning barn for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed. With blinding speed, I didn't shoot Thorne. I snapped my wrist and fired at the man holding Lily. The bullet tore through the thug's shoulder. He screamed, dropping the knife and losing his grip on the girl. "Run, Lily!" I roared. Lily bolted toward the house. Thorne's second man raised his rifle to shoot her in the back. I fired my second shot, catching him square in the chest. He dropped dead in the dirt. But the distraction cost me. Thorne fired. The bullet grazed my rib cage, tearing through leather and flesh like a hot iron. The impact spun me around, dropping me to one knee. My Colt slipped from my sweaty, bloodied grip, falling into the dirt just out of reach. I gasped, clutching my side. The pain was blinding. Thorne walked forward, his face twisted in a snarl of pure hatred. He cocked the hammer of his silver revolver and aimed it squarely at the center of my forehead. "You should have burned 7 years ago, you miserable savage," Thorne hissed. I stared down the barrel of his gun, refusing to close my eyes. I had saved Clara. I had saved Lily. If I had to pay with my life, it was a good death. "Go to hell, Thaddeus," I growled. Bang! The gunshot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. But I didn't fall. I didn't feel the bullet. Instead, Thaddeus Thorne let out a high-pitched, agonizing shriek. The silver revolver flew from his grasp as his right hand exploded in a mess of blood and bone. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his mangled wrist, screaming in shock and agony. I turned my head. Standing 10 feet away, her face covered in soot, her dress torn and scorched, was Clara. She was holding the Winchester rifle the sniper had dropped earlier. Smoke was still curling from the barrel. Her stance was perfect, her hands completely steady. She cocked the lever, chambering another round with a terrifying mechanical clack. She walked forward, the muzzle pointed directly at Thorne's face. "He isn't going to hell," Clara said, her voice ringing out like a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "And neither are you. You're going to federal prison." Thorne whimpered on the ground, a broken, pathetic creature stripped of his power. I pushed myself up off the ground, ignoring the burning pain in my side. I walked over to my wife, reaching out to gently push the barrel of the rifle down. She looked at me, the lethal fire in her eyes melting into overwhelming relief. She dropped the rifle and threw her arms around my neck. I buried my face in her shoulder, holding her, holding my family. "It's over," I whispered, the words carrying 7 years of weight off my soul. "It's finally over." As the sun fully set, painting the canyon in the cool, peaceful light of dusk, Eli rode into the yard, leading a battered but unbroken Thaddeus Thorne tied over a saddle. Lily ran from the house, throwing herself into our arms. The barn was ash. Red Rock was scarred. But as I stood in the dirt with my wife holding my hand, looking out over the land that was finally ours, I knew the ghost was gone forever. The devil of Red Rock was dead. But Silas Vance, the husband, the protector, had just begun to live. The U.S. Marshals arrived 2 days later, riding hard up the canyon trail with the rising sun at their backs. Lily's telegram had hit the Denver office like a stick of dynamite. It turned out the federal judge I had been waiting for wasn't the only one hunting Thaddeus Thorne. The government had been looking for a reason to tear apart his corrupt empire for years, but no one had ever survived long enough to hand them the matches. Until us. When the lead marshal, a weathered, no-nonsense man named Sterling, stepped down from his horse into the ash-covered yard of Red Rock, he didn't look at me like I was a monster. He looked at the smoking ruins of my barn, then at Thaddeus Thorne, who was currently tied to a corral post, nursing a shattered, blood-soaked wrist and a bruised ego. I walked out of the house, my ribs tightly bandaged beneath a clean shirt, and handed Sterling the heavy leather folio from the locked room upstairs. Sterling spent an hour sitting on my porch, flipping through the meticulously gathered ledgers, the Pinkerton reports, and the sworn affidavits. When he finally closed the book, he looked up at me, letting out a long, low whistle. "Vance," the marshal said, shaking his head, "you didn't just build a case, you built a gallows." There's enough paper in here to hang Thorne, his associates, and half the corrupt bankers in the territory, including Sheriff Miller. Just make sure he never sees the sky outside of a prison yard again, I replied, my voice rough but steady. Sterling stood up, tipping his hat to Clara, who stood by my side. You have my word on it, ma'am, and the federal injunction holds. The debt on Silver Creek is wiped clean, seized as evidence of racketeering. Your land is safe. Both of them. We stood on the porch and watched as the marshals loaded Thorne into a wagon. He didn't look back. The arrogant Eastern Baron had been broken by the very land and the very man he had tried to destroy. A week later, the ashes of the barn had cooled, and the rebuilding began. Clara and I rode into Delwood to order fresh timber and supplies. I drove the buckboard, fully expecting the usual routine. The lowered eyes, the terrified whispers, the women crossing themselves as the Devil of Red Rock passed by. I was prepared for it. I had lived with it for 7 years. But as we pulled the team to a halt in front of the Mercantile, the street was eerily quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the heavy, awkward silence of a reckoning. The news of Thorne's arrest and the federal sweep had hit the town like a tidal wave. Sheriff Miller had been hauled off in irons, and the truth about the fire 7 years ago, the truth about Catherine, Elias Thorne, and the fact that I had been hunting a monster, not acting as one, had been splashed across the front page of the county paper. I stepped down from the wagon, offering my hand to Clara. As her boots touched the boardwalk, the doors of the Mercantile opened. Out stepped Mayor Higgins, followed closely by old Mrs. Pewitt and half a dozen other townsfolk. They didn't shrink back. They stood their ground, though Higgins looked as uncomfortable as a man standing on a hot stove. He took off his bowler hat, wringing it in his plump hands. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time without terror blinding his eyes. Mr. Vance, Higgins started, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. Silas, the town council, and the folks of Delwood, we owe you an apology, a profound one. I stood perfectly still, my thumbs hooked into my gun belt. I didn't say a word. For 7 years, Higgins continued, looking down at his boots before forcing himself to meet my gaze again. We let a good man carry the weight of a terrible tragedy alone. We let the rumors turn you into something you weren't, because it was easier to be afraid of you than to stand up to the men who actually burned your life down. You saved this valley from Thorne, and we treated you like a stray dog. Mrs. Pewitt stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. She didn't speak, but she reached out and briefly, gently touched my forearm. From a woman who used to cross the street to avoid my shadow, it was a monumental gesture. I looked at the faces of the people who had shunned me. I felt the phantom weight of the anger I had carried for so long, but to my surprise, it was gone. The fire had burned it all away. I gave a single, slow nod. I don't need a parade, Higgins, I said, my voice maintaining its familiar gravel, though the lethal edge was entirely absent. But I do need 100 pounds of iron nails and a dozen heavy crossbeams. And if you overcharge my wife for flour ever again, we're going to have a problem. A collective breath was exhaled. Higgins actually let out a watery bark of laughter. At cost, Mr. Vance, everything at cost. You have my word. As we loaded the wagon, I felt Clara's hand slip into mine. I looked down at her. She was beaming, her gray eyes shining with an immense, quiet pride. I squeezed her hand, a strange, unfamiliar lightness expanding in my chest. It was late September when the new barn was finally finished. The oppressive summer heat had broken, giving way to the crisp, golden bite of autumn. The herds from Red Rock and Silver Creek were merged, grazing peacefully by the deep, rushing waters of the aquifer. The evening sun was sinking below the canyon rim, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, amber, and burnt orange. I was standing on the porch of the main house, leaning against the wooden rail. Down in the yard, Eli was showing Lily how to properly throw a lasso. The old mute's face cracked into a rare, genuine smile as the girl laughed at her own clumsy attempts. The screen door creaked behind me. Clara stepped out. She was wearing a soft yellow dress, her dark hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She carried 2 cups of coffee, handing one to me as she leaned against the rail by my side. We stood in comfortable silence for a long moment, watching the colors shift across the horizon. "It's beautiful tonight," she murmured, taking a sip from her cup. "It is," I agreed. But I wasn't looking at the sky. I was looking at her. I reached into the inner pocket of my leather vest. My fingers brushed against a piece of heavy parchment. I pulled it out and set my coffee cup down on the rail. Clara turned her head, her brow furrowing slightly as she recognized the document. It was the contract. The marriage agreement she had handed to me through the corral fence on that blisteringly hot afternoon. "What are you doing with that?" she asked softly. I unfolded the paper. I looked at the neat, elegant ink outlining our terms: protection, water rights, a boundary, a transaction. "It's a good contract," I said, my voice low. "Calculated, practical. It saved my herd, and it saved your land." Then, deliberately, I took the parchment in both hands and tore it straight down the middle. Clara's eyes widened slightly, a small gasp escaping her lips as I tore it again and again, until the contract was nothing but a handful of white confetti. I opened my hands, letting the evening breeze catch the pieces and scatter them into the canyon, washing away the last remnants of our desperate bargain. "Silas?" she whispered, turning fully toward me. I took off my hat, tossing it onto the wooden chair behind me. I stepped away from the rail, moving into the center of the porch. Then, with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who finally knows exactly where he belongs, I dropped down onto one knee in the dust. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her gray eyes swimming with sudden, brilliant tears. I reached out and took her trembling left hand in my large, calloused ones. I didn't have a ring. I only had the scarred, battered heart that she had dragged out of the ashes. "You walked up to my gate when everyone else in the world was running away," I said, my voice thick with an emotion that threatened to break it. "You looked a monster in the eye and demanded a husband. You fought for me, Clara. You bled for me. You gave me back the sun, and the rain, and the breath in my lungs." I looked up into her beautiful, weeping face, bearing my soul entirely. "I don't want a contract," I swore to her. "I don't want boundaries, and I don't want a business partner. I want the woman I love. I want the woman who saved my life." I swallowed hard, the rough gravel of my voice softening into a desperate, tender plea. "Clara Hayes, will you do me the absolute honor of marrying me? For real this time. For no other reason than because I cannot survive another day on this earth without you." She didn't speak right away. A sob caught in her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. She dropped her coffee cup, letting it shatter on the porch boards, and fell to her knees in the dust right in front of me. She threw her arms around my neck, crashing her lips against mine. The kiss wasn't born of fear or adrenaline or desperation like in the cabin. It was a promise. It was deep, slow, and infinite, sealing a bond that neither fire nor time nor the cruelty of the world could ever break again. I wrapped my massive arms tightly around her waist, burying my face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and home. "Yes," she wept against my skin, her hands holding me as if she would never let go. "Yes, Silas. Yes." I held my wife in the fading light of the canyon. The ghosts were gone. The silence of Red Rock was no longer a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief, but a quiet, golden peace. The devil of Delwood had died in the flames, and in his place a man had finally found his way home. This wasn't just a story about revenge or survival. It's a story about redemption, about how love can reach even the darkest corners of a wounded soul. Sometimes, The people we fear the most are the ones carrying the deepest pain and the greatest courage. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Never judge a soul by rumors, because behind every scar, there might be a story of sacrifice and love. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.
And so, as the sun slowly sinks behind the jagged edges of Red Rock Canyon, what remains is not the echo of gunfire, nor the ashes of a burned barn, but something far more powerful. What remains is a man reborn. Silas Vance was never truly the monster the world believed him to be. He was a man forged in fire, broken by loss, and buried beneath the weight of grief and silence. For 7 long years he lived like a ghost, breathing, working, surviving, but never truly living. And then Clara walked through his gate, not with fear, not with judgment, but with courage. She saw something no one else dared to see. Not the scars, not the rumors, not the shadow, but the man beneath it all. And that changed everything. Because sometimes redemption doesn't come from within. Sometimes it arrives in the form of another human being, someone brave enough to stand still when everyone else runs. This story teaches us something deeply human. We live in a world that is quick to judge, quick to label, quick to turn people into stories that are easier to believe than the truth. But behind every rumor, every scar, every hardened soul, there is a history we do not see. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it becomes silence. Sometimes it becomes distance. Sometimes it becomes a man like Silas Vance. And yet, no matter how deep the wound, no matter how long someone has lived in darkness, there is always a path back. But that path is rarely walked alone. Clara didn't just save her land. She didn't just survive Thorn. She did something far greater. She gave a broken man a reason to believe in life again. And in return, Silas didn't just protect her. He chose to love again, to trust again, to stand not as a ghost of the past, but as a man with a future. That is the true heart of this story. Not revenge, not violence, but transformation. Because strength is not found in how many enemies you defeat. It is found in whether you still have the courage to love after everything has been taken from you. And perhaps the most important lesson of all, do not judge a soul by the stories told about them. Because sometimes, the person the world fears the most is the one who has already endured more than anyone else. In the end, Red Rock was never just a place. It was a symbol. A place where pain was buried, where truth was revealed, and where love, quiet, stubborn, and unbreakable, took root in the most unlikely ground. And maybe that's why stories like this stay with us. Because deep down, we all want to believe the same thing, that no matter how lost we become, no matter how far we fall, there is still a way back home. This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work.